Welcome to the Business of Podcast. I'm your host Deepak from India. Today we are delighted to welcome Dr. Achyuta Adhvaryu as our distinguished guest on the podcast. Dr. Achyuta Adhvaryu is the Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at the School of Global Policy and Strategy and the inaugural director of the 21st Century India Center at University of California, San Diego. His research lies at the intersection of development, organizational, labor, and health economics, focusing on evidence-based solutions to practical workplace challenges. Professor Adhvaryu earned a BA in Mathematics and Economics from the University of Pennsylvania and a PhD in Economics from Yale University. Before joining the University of California, San Diego, he held faculty appointments at the University of Michigan and Yale. He is the co-founder of the Good Business Lab, a good and global non-profit that partners with firms to measurably improve the well-being of low-income workers. In today's episode, Professor Achyuta Adhvaryu discusses his study, Platform Work, evidence from drivers in India, Indonesia, and Kenya, using surveys and platform data to map drivers' earnings, costs, and career paths. Just not keep you waiting, please join me in welcoming Dr. Achyuta Adhvaryu to the conversation. Professor Achyuta, we are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Thank you. Professor, what motivated you to study two-wheeler platform drivers across India, Indonesia, and Kenya specifically? And what was the biggest cross-country difference that surprised you?
Well, I think the motivation is driven by the huge surge in participation in the platform economy all over the world. We've seen a massive increase since platforms became more prevalently available in low-income country contexts, especially in uptake of these types of jobs. And there's a lot of interest from people like myself who study the sort of economic lives of low-income workers um, in what the platform economy might do in terms of sort of the benefits of platform work for those individuals and their sort of households and the income that they can make. As you know, in a lot of countries, informal labor is sort of the norm, and so most people are working, not in a formal kind of salaried position, but rather kind of in a variety of different jobs, whether, doing their own kind of entrepreneurial business or working for an informal firm, usually a very small one. Um, and often, people have several jobs across a variety of different types of work. So, in that kind of environment, it makes it potentially very easy to take on something like a driving job or a delivery gig if you've got the right, vehicle or capital already. And so it's potentially a way to kind of make a lot of income for yourself, for your family. And so this is like a very interesting vehicle to study, to think about kind of is that kind of fulfilling that promise of bringing income opportunities to a lot of low-income workers. On the other hand, we've seen the potential dark side of platform work and a lot of worry and concern that workers are not being paid enough and are being subjected to really uh, poor conditions in the out in the street, especially when there's heat waves, there's massive amounts of pollution, there's risks of driving in sort of dense urban contexts. There's risks of driving late at night in areas that are not safe, etc. And so, there's also a lot of concern that um, despite the rise of this phenomenon and a lot of workers signing on, um, this may not be great for workers. And how do we make the platform work actually work for people in a way that actually benefits them and doesn't just feed, more profit into the kind of in the platforms themselves. So I think it's an open question, sort of which one is the case, and we've seen a bunch of narratives on both sides being advocated in the news and all that, in India and around the world. But we sort of wanted to bring some data to bear to this question.
Professor, your paper emphasizes net earnings after operating costs rather than just gross pay. What
Right.
costs mattered most in each country, and how did you measure them credibly?
Yeah, so yeah, as you mentioned, I think what people care about, what these workers care about at the end of the day is how much am I taking home, right? And this is a, you know, consistent issue across the platform economy. This started with Uber drivers and other kind of platform workers in the gig economy in the US. And the same issues kind of apply all over the world. The idea is, gross earnings are not take-home pay, and what we should really be comparing to wages is how much are people earning net of costs. And sometimes costs can be quite large, and workers often complain that things like, fuel costs or vehicle equipment costs, rental costs, etc., are actually eating into their gross earnings in a way that then doesn't provide a lot, for them to take home. So I think we wanted to measure this very carefully, and it's important to kind of provide that kind of net earnings measure because that's what we can really, kind of benchmark to other kinds of work and to really be able to understand are people actually earning on net from this type of economic activity. So in terms of the costs, as you asked, I think the largest cost across all of these contexts is fuel. And fuel makes up a big chunk of total cost, and it actually eats away at a big chunk of the gross earnings as well. And we found that the fuel costs vary by country, and total costs actually also vary quite substantially by country. It turns out that when you look at the hourly net earnings, about a third of that is over the over all the countries is eaten away by cost. But that chunk is largest in Kenya. So it's more than a half of the gross earnings are eaten away by costs, mostly fuel related costs in Kenya. In India and Indonesia, it's about a third. So, pretty substantial reduction resulting from having to pay for equipment and fuel.
Professor, you find an important distinction between hourly net earnings versus monthly net earnings. How
Yeah.
should listeners interpret this trade-off, especially given that platform work allows people to work more than full time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think this is one of the main results that's very interesting from our study, which basically we wanted to track both kind of a comparable earnings measure to a wage. So we wanted to say, look, for every hour that you work in the platform economy, how much are you taking home? Because that's the sort of most uh, kind of direct comparison that you can make with a wage if you're going to work at a firm or something like that. But we also want to track, how much are you taking home on net in a given period, and we chose a month because that sort of allows for time for adjustment. Some weeks you might work a lot, some weeks you might work less. And of course, when you're thinking about the difference between hourly and monthly income or earnings, um, that difference is potentially kind of driven by labor supply differences, right? So if I'm working full time, or the full time equivalent, say 40 hours, then I will scale my hourly earnings by that amount. But as you pointed out, the interesting thing about platform work is that you have the flexibility to work as much as you want or as little as you want. So a lot of drivers actually work very little and, just to work a couple hours a day here and there. Um, but there's a substantial fraction of drivers in each of the countries that actually use platforms as their major source of income. So when you focus in on that subset of drivers, those people actually work a lot more than full time. So the average for those individuals, it varies by country. But for example, in India, it's something like 58 or 60 hours a week. In Indonesia, it's even more. Those drivers in Indonesia are working about 70 or 72 hours a week. So there's an incredible, flexibility that you have. So this is, both potentially a good thing and a bad thing, right? On the good side, if I have the capacity and want to work a little bit more and earn more, then platform work offers that. And often other jobs, that's more tightly regulated or it's, only occasionally available that I can work full time and things like that. Whereas in platform work, I can do that anytime I want. Um, but it's also potentially a bad thing because, especially if you're not earning that much, what some drivers have expressed is that they feel trapped, that they have to work. Essentially, I have to work 70 hours a week because if I'm only making a couple dollars per hour, then I need to scale that by a lot to, put a reasonable amount of food on the table and have enough for rent and utilities for my family. So, I think that, in India, we're still in that sort of de reasonable point of, I think those full-time drivers are working quite a bit, but they're also earning quite a lot. So if you just benchmark monthly earnings to other kinds of occupations, um, monthly earnings for platform work are much higher than monthly earnings for comparable other low-skilled informal labor. But hourly earnings are more on par with those other comparables. So, in India, it's sort of a potentially a good story where, platform work's flexibility allows you to earn something like 25 to 30% more income for your family. In Indonesia, perhaps it's a slightly different story where there's, per hour earnings on net are pretty low. And so, workers are working a lot. And when you get above 70 hours, there's probably a problem there. That's a lot of work and not a lot of time to rest.
Professor, can you walk us through the data advantage of combining surveys with platform administrative data and what each source can reveal that the others can't?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a good question. One of the major advantages I think of doing this work, with our partners at ID Insight, and I should mention, this work is in collaboration with a whole uh, team at ID Insight, which is an organization that does um, a lot of development focused, kind of empirical work around the world. And I think uh, the advantage of this study is that the ID Insight team and I kind of had partnerships with all of these kind of three platforms across the three countries, which then offered the chance to take a look at their entirety of their administrative data and um, one, draw insights from the sort of universe of their data. So this is not, of course, all platform companies, but in each of the three countries, we partnered with um, one of the largest platforms in that country. And so the conclusions we draw can kind of reasonably be applied to many other platforms or extended to other platforms as well. Um, and then you can also sample from the universe of the administrative data to say, look, we see everybody who was ever on this platform. We can then basically take a representative sample of various kinds of workers, and we've got a way of tracking them down because we know their numbers or know their information because that's part of the administrative data, and then we can track them down to ask them questions through surveys. So the advantage of doing the administrative data part is we can see really clearly on that platform at least, how much are you working? How much are you earning? Um, where are you working? What kinds of jobs are you taking? What's the margins on those jobs? What are you earning on those, etc. So the really, really detailed information on labor supply and earnings. Um, what we can't see are two important things. One, as you know, a lot of people do this sort of multi-homing thing where they work on multiple platforms. So, if I might be on Uber, but I'm also on Lyft and DoorDash. And so just looking at Uber data would only give me a partial picture of what I'm earning and how much time I'm spending. Um, so that's one thing that we want to ask about. So we get the full labor supply picture by asking people, about those questions. And the second thing that we can learn from these surveys is um, the information on costs, because obviously the platform doesn't have that information. So that we would need to kind of survey people to get an understanding of that. So we did that in, not all the countries, but a couple of the countries. The um, the other thing that, survey data gets you is you can kind of track the trajectories of these workers. And, for example, if workers left the platform, they're no longer active. What are they doing? We wouldn't be able to see that if we just looked at the administrative data, but in surveys, we could ask that question.
Professor, the study reports very different utilization rates. For example, productive time versus logging time across context. Why is
Hmm.
utilization such a central concept for understanding gig earnings?
Yeah, great question. I think that as I'm sure you've, seen just being out and calling Ubers and or even rickshaws and things like that for that matter, people, spend a lot of time on these platforms, um, while they're logged in, but they're actually not, on a ride or, on a job. And so when they're waiting for jobs, they're sort of sitting around, usually on the side of the road, and relaxing or chatting with peers, etc. But that's not sort of productive time, right? That's sort of not time that they're earning. So in some sense, it's important to distinguish that, because the more, the platforms can actually do what they're supposed to, which is basically match demand and supply, the more that these workers are able to kind of use their time productively. So while I'm in my car or while I'm in my two-wheeler, and I'm ready to do work, um, you know, I can the more deliveries I can make during that time, the better. So I think that that's a really um, critical feature here, and it turns out that some platforms are better than doing at others than doing this. So it depends on demand periods. Is it a peak period or not? So those things are important to understand, and they vary quite widely across countries. The more that platforms can do on that front to feed people jobs and match them up with appropriate jobs that are close by and things like that, I think the more productive workers will be and the more business platforms will have.
Professor, we observe that many drivers are part-time and many diversify income sources. What does your evidence suggest about platform work as a primary job versus a supplementary income strategy?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, a substantial fraction, which actually varies quite dramatically across the three countries. Um, but a big chunk of workers in each of the countries does do platform work as their major, primary occupation. So they're spending more than full time on uh, on the platforms doing work every week. The there is another chunk of uh, drivers that basically only use the platform when they have kind of financial emergencies or sort of low periods in their other jobs. So, the uh, one example, for example, is construction work, right? If you're doing construction work, you're going to have some periods where you're employed and you've got a project and they're building something and you're, taking part in that and getting regular income. When that project ends, you might have, a couple months where you're waiting around for another project to start, and you've got some time, and you can use the platform as a source of income. And there's a fraction of drivers in each of the countries who actually do that. So when we're thinking about the roles that the platform economy can play in workers' lives, and in the broader kind of economy in general, I think it can play both of those, which is really interesting, right? It can basically be a source of primary income for those who want to do this work as their primary job, but it can also be a source of sort of safety net, or a financial kind of um, employer of last resort, or basically a way for people to earn even when there's other earning opportunities are not available. So I think that's a really interesting kind of dual role that the safety net that the platform can play. The one thing I'll caveat though is like the way that algorithms work and the platforms kind of incentivize workers. Platforms want workers to work on their platform all the time, so they really heavily incentivize workers who are constantly engaging, right? And if you don't, your incentives die down, and in some cases, people are even kicked off the platforms or blacklisted, etc. And that risks potentially the safety net role, because if you don't use the platform often, but you do when you need it, then it's important that platforms kind of are tooled to incorporate that kind of labor supply as well.
Professor, exit trajectories differ sharply. In India and Indonesia, many drivers leave for better paying full time jobs, while in Kenya, exits are often involuntary. What
Yeah.
explains this pattern and what do they imply about local labor markets?
Yeah, I mean, so I can, it's a interesting fact that we uncovered. So as you mentioned, you know, uh, full-time drivers who exit, a large fraction of them who exit in India and to a certain extent Indonesia, um, leave for sort of better paying full-time opportunities, so wage, earning opportunities, and that suggests perhaps that the platform work can be a stepping stone, or once you have uh, done a bunch of work on the platform and you avail yourself of an outside opportunity, you apply to another job, you're able to then sort of like switch out and kind of graduate up into kind of salaried positions, et cetera, that pay more. um, the fact that we find the kind of involuntary exit in Kenya, um, I think that, speaks to the potential dangers of platform work when earnings are very low. So we find that in Kenya, the sort of net earnings, once you take away costs, which are like 57% or something of the total um, gross earnings that people make, net earnings are very low on average, except for during, peak periods. So during the peak period, earnings can be quite high, but during other periods, they're very, very low, and that may actually force workers out of this platform work into other kinds of work involuntarily. And then once you're out, it's harder to get back in, and you're sort of, some of these workers are then taking on driving gigs and delivery gigs, but outside of the platform space, which is much worse in some sense because the demand is harder to come by. It's not algorithmically matched and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's, you know, what does it say about the local labor market? I don't want to speculate too much, but my general understanding of the facts is that in India, drivers tend to be younger and better educated in the first place. So drivers are already people who are kind of, have high school or even college degrees and who are young, very employable. And they're, using platform work for a certain period of time, maybe while they apply to other jobs, etc. But once you get that salaried position, that's a higher wage, you jump into that, and so it allows for that time perhaps to search in the market. Um, and that's important for India because, as young, educated men in particular have a really high unemployment rate in cities in India, even higher than the less educated population, because those individuals who have college degrees and things like that are not willing to take like, construction jobs or other informal labor. So, I think it's indicative of that feature of the labor market. In Kenya, and Indonesia, the profiles of the workers are quite different, and they're less young and less educated. So I think that might explain sort of the trajectories a little bit.
Professor, one third of drivers use platform work as an emergency buffer or during slow periods. What does this tell us about gig work as a financial safety net? And what risks come with relying on it that way?
Yeah, I think like as I mentioned, I think it's interesting that that platform work can play these dual roles where about a third of people use the platform as a primary source of income and about a third of people use it as only during financial safety net periods. And I think the only caveat I would, issue is the one I mentioned before, which is sometimes platforms in their quest to incentivize greater usage by drivers and by the agents, um, exclude those who only use it occasionally. And so, that would diminish the safety net value the more the algorithms push us towards that equilibrium.
Professional results on financial inclusion are mixed across countries. Where do you see platforms genuinely expanding access, like banking, mobile money, digital credit, and where is the impact limited?
Yeah, so I think there is a tremendous interest in the use of platform data to increase the financial inclusion of a big swath of this workforce. I think the idea is um, that there's a digital footprint that's created, right, when you're earning through these platforms. And so, if I am an informal worker, um, I don't have a W-2 or I don't have an income statement that I can take to the bank and say, here's my income proof, and I'd like to, based on this proof that I'm employed, borrow a certain amount on a loan, for example. Um, so without that, a lot of those workers, face much stronger credit constraints and are unable to borrow for, things that they want to spend in their lives or shocks that they might encounter, et cetera. Um, and what digital footprints do is they offer kind of a proxy for that kind of formal statement of income or other earnings, right? So if I can provide my history of payments on the app, I can show you that, look, I work more than 50 hours a week. I earn, a very respectable amount, and that should qualify me for a loan, just like it would if I gave you the same statement from a formal company. So basically, there's a lot of uh, digital financial providers that are now offering all kinds of products um, by tapping into the platforms, partnering with the platforms, as well as partnering with other financial institutions, to use the data in this way. So I think that offers a lot of opportunity. It also has a lot of risk because we know that especially for populations that have not had a lot of experience with the financial market, with financial products, the risk of being manipulated or taken advantage of is high. And, there's always, companies out there that don't have the best scruples or are willing to kind of charge hidden fees or take advantage in some way to make a buck. And so unfortunately, although that's not the case with all these providers, I think there's a lot of well-intentioned and just, people who are trying to make money, but in an ethical way by banking this previously unbanked population. Um, I think that, there's enough of that, those shenanigans going on out there that regulators are paying a lot of attention now and perhaps coming down too hard, like it's often the case in India, right? That, um, once you draw attention to something, I think the instinct from the government is to come down in a very draconian way on these providers. So my hope is like there's some middle ground that can be reached where um, there's enough access to these products that people can actually avail themselves of, say, a small loan or something like that using this data that's generated by the platforms, um, while also regulating the worst case scenarios of predatory lending and hidden fees and putting people in these kinds of unfortunate situations. So I'm hopeful that we'll get to that middle ground. The faster we get there, the better it is for this market.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. If you were advising platforms, policymakers, and worker organizations, what would you recommend as the most practical changes to improve drivers' well-being without eliminating the flexibility drivers value?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that come to mind that are important here. Um, I think one interesting um, observation around flexibility is that workers can work as much or as little as they want, as we mentioned. So, when we're thinking, a lot of worker rights groups in these countries are worried that workers are kind of essentially coerced into working too much, and they're suggesting, things like capping the number of hours that are allowed to be worked on a given platform. I don't think that that's a very good idea, because that sort of undermines the flexibility, right, that workers have. Um, Instead, I think it's best if you kind of tackle the root causes of some of these issues, right? So when we're thinking about the net earnings, a big part, as we discussed, is the amount that are deducted in costs, right? And the biggest one of those costs is fuel. Um, so already, I think we're seeing a change in that because, EVs or two-wheeler EVs in particular are becoming really, really prevalent and also cheap in India and in other contexts. So I think we'll see over time a big move away from gas vehicles and into these kind of two-wheeler EVs, which then kind of, opens up the potential for very low costs on fuel, subject to electricity prices and charging costs being kept low. So how do you do that as a government? Well, I think for many reasons, it makes a lot of sense for the government to expand, or subsidize the expansion of charging stations available in urban contexts. So, there's lots of interesting policies that you could try here because right now, as I'm sure you've heard, the charging stations are few and far between. And so, when these workers are trying to do their deliveries and they're running out of electricity, they need to recharge their battery. They have to wait in lines that are like 3, 4 hours long to charge up their battery. That's that's going to ruin your workday. That's unproductive. So basically, if we can make charging stations more densely, kind of situated in urban areas, so that it's easy to get to one and the line is not that long. And also think about kind of different policies that might encourage easier charging. So, for example, battery swaps is like one, type of charging that might be much, much faster. It's used in China all the time. I think that that's something that um, probably the government, would have to subsidize or, provide the infrastructure or the land for, et cetera. But I think that could totally, revolutionize the cost structure, and that would raise the net earnings as we saw, from our calculations. So I think that's one thing, just like tackling the costs. Um, the other is platforms, are very unique because there's millions of people who are using them every day and have a high touch environment with these workers, right? So then it's really easy to potentially offer other benefits to the working population through the platform itself. So, one idea is around financial benefits. You might offer things like small loans or insurance for, low periods or heat or, other things directly through the app. And you can even do transfers through the app because it's already linked into the bank accounts of the workers. So, the ease of doing all that is very, very high. And the question is sort of like, what are the things that workers really want? And that I think we need to test for and figure out. I think, I've been doing a lot of work in this space and running a few trials with my nonprofit Good Business Lab and a bunch of platform partners and worker, advocacy groups, et cetera. And the results are still pending, and we need to sort of see what the trials find. But I think the where things are, looking is that platform work can actually offer these benefits very easily, and there's quite a lot of interest from workers in taking them up. So I think that's the other space where we could do a lot of innovative types of benefit delivery, even though platforms are not directly employing these workers, it actually might encourage workers to use one platform over another if that platform is offering lots of great benefits and amenities. So I think it's also a competitive edge that these platforms could wield.
Professor Achyuta, thank you for joining us today and for sharing such thoughtful insights from your research. Your perspectives on platform work across India, Indonesia, and Kenya add important nuance to how we understand flexibility, earnings, and worker well-being in the gig economy. On behalf of our listeners and Business Talk, thank you once again for your time and for generally sharing your research and insights. We hope to have a pleasure of welcoming you back soon. Thank you once again.
Yeah, thank you. Very insightful questions and glad to discuss them with you. Thanks a lot.